were on a weekday. And as I was going and doing the clipboard on both these times, I was able to make some notes of what I was seeing. In Zone A, being here on Elliott Street, I noticed that there's no parking at all on the south side, so we didn't count those as spaces. And on the north side, especially during the afternoon, noontime period, there'll be a lot of people that run in and pick up their sandwich. They park right on Elliott Street right there, even though the spaces are not marked. They park in that area. And up in the westerly end of the north side, a lot of the parking was actually residents who would pull out one car and put it on the street, and then the other car would come in and out for most of the day, and then notice by the end of the day on Saturday, the cars were all back in the driveway again. That was just only, they didn't have to jockey the cars in and out all day long. I mean, the space was available, there was nothing illegal about it, and it was convenient for them. I used to do that when I lived in Brookline. There was really no parking, so we had one driveway and two cars. We jockeyed the cars, and no harm, no foul. It's just the parking was available, and that's what we did. B is this area down here on Central Avenue. There's a lot of high turnover parking right at the sandwich shop and right at the intersection, close to the liquor store and all that. Those spaces turned over pretty well. And there was spaces down in here that on the west side, down on the south end of Central Avenue, you got some residents there. And sometimes they'd leave the cars out pretty much all day too, whether that was jockeying around or more convenience or something else. I wasn't sure. Over on the east side of this end of Central Avenue, it was pretty much a mix between shoppers going into the hair salon and some of the employees that were working there. And then when that got occupied, then there'd be more people that would use the parking lot in the back, but when those spaces were empty, there'd be less use in the back. They use that section instead. D is up in this area up in here. This is Elliott Street. We did notice that, one fellow pulled up with the bike rack in the back. He took the bike off the car, and then he went for his ride up the bike route, path up in that area in there. So I'm hoping that there are other opportunities for people that drive that they can actually park someplace else and take it for a ride. And we noticed that the cleaners had two white vans, and they were using that pretty much most of the day. In the auto repair shop, he'd be putting cars out on the street and using them. And there, sometimes he was actually working right on the car with the hood up on the street. Other times they'd be stacking the cars and storing the cars. And he's got a very good business, but he doesn't have an awful lot of parking on the lot itself, you know. E, this is this area up in here. There was a lot of, in the morning, you'd see a lot of people that would park and then get their morning coffee and muffins or donuts, whatever it is that they get down there. They did a really good business down there, but you'd have a lot of high turnover parking in the morning. About late morning, you'd start to see some of the employees from Steel and Rye parking right by that back door over there. And then there'd be more employees that would come and move out of the day, and then by the evening park, they'd be parking up in this area for Steel and Rye. Brook had a lot of all-day parking, and then, like I said, 9 space. We looked at from Elliott Street down about 300 feet or so. Actually, it was a third telephone pole, because after that, you couldn't see that the spaces were available, so it didn't make any sense to count those. But those were pretty much occupied all day long until late afternoon on the weekday. Then there was a little bit less occupied, and then it'd start picking up again as customers were coming for Steel and Ride. They'd see those spaces available, and they'd walk over to the other. So that was pretty much it. G is our lot in here, the proponent's lot. That was pretty much all-day parking, except for once in a while someone else would pull in. Then they cross the street to pick up a sandwich or go to the liquor store, and we saw them coming out of there and coming over with a package. So there will be short-term parking, and I guess what I got out of it was there is a lot of 2-hour parking. This is mostly all 2-hour parking up here that's not being utilized. And this, up in here, this starts your service zone. So maybe we want to take a look at, or someone should look at, where that service zone should be, because if we can get a long-term park or all-day parking from either employees or storage of vehicles, or you know, if we can get the long-term parking out of there and put them up in that area, then obviously there'll be more short-term parking available for the shops, the sandwich shop, the liquor store, and the others down, the pizza shop down in that area. So that's pretty much what I got out of it, is there is parking, but it's not being utilized to the highest level.
So are you suggesting that in the area around the shops, that there's no current limitation on parking? You can park there all day?
No, there's 2-hour parking, and there's some of the 1-hour parking. In fact, right out in front of the shops on Elliott Street, that goes to 15 minutes after, I think it is 6 o'clock at night. Did you write that down someplace? I'll get that back for you. I did write it down. That's short-term parking around supper time.
What do you anticipate, if you know the answer to this question? It's noontime on a Saturday, regular time of year. How many parking spaces on the street would you attribute to the new development? How many? Well,
what I did is I looked at a couple of things, and I looked at the, I might as well read that. According to the Institute of Transportation Engineers, the 57 dwelling units may have an average peak parking demand of 1.23 vehicles per dwelling unit. And if you take the 50, that's right out of the ITE manual, I have it with me. But it says that's your average peak for an apartment in this type of area. And then it's just, so if you took the 1.23 that was in the book that you should have, and you average peak, and you multiply that by 57, you happen to get 70 parking spaces, which are pretty much what we're providing here, you know. And then it also said in that report that obviously it recognizes that the demand would be reduced by the proximity of light rail transit with the stop at the rear of the building. It didn't say what that 1.23 should go down to. It did say that it should be that the demand would be less. There was an article published in the ITE Journal in February 2013, and that showed that there was absolutely less parking demand in an urban setting, and that further that transit access resulted in fewer vehicles being parked than what you'd actually designed for without the transit vehicle in that area. So it really doesn't say how much of a credit you should get for the transit. Maybe the peer review consultant knows of someplace that I didn't see it, but I looked hard for it, Jennifer.
Right. I would say the only thing I might look at is what the Journey to Work statistics are for this area, because they'd probably, you could get that factor of what percentage is currently using transit. That's possible. But I would point out, just because I did review the parking information, who I think is going to impact the on-street parking is actually a guest. I think the folks will park in their parking space, and it's going to be a guest who's going to pull up on the street and use the on-street parking. And looking at Zone A, because again, that is the zone in this parking analysis that is closest to the site, Zone A has plenty of available parking with the exception of only 1 hour, which was at 11 a.m. on a weekday. All of the other data points are 2, 3, 4 parking spaces being used, meaning there's 3, 4, or 5 parking spaces available in that immediate stretch right along the site frontage.
Again, that was lunchtime hour, 11 to 12. So.
Yep. And on the Saturday, there's even less demand. There's between 0 and 3 vehicles. So on the Saturday, at every hour, there was plenty of available parking. And again, I'm just thinking it's going to be more the guest, and to think that 3 or 4 guest vehicles might pull up and park there along the site frontage to go visit a friend, etc., I think seems pretty reasonable. But I do, certainly I could help. I'm sure Jack knows where to get the, information on what the commuting patterns are for residents who are currently in this area. And just
the only thing I'd caution on that is that the census would be based on existing land use, which is a lot of single families up in that area, or 2 families. And what we're looking at here is multifamily. And you may not have the same, even though the census is the same block, you might have something different.
That's very true.
And in that case, I might look further up over the hill by the Milton Hill House. They have enough parking of their own up top, but maybe there's some visitors or guests on the street down below. I could take a look at that if it's something that you need.
Well, it may be helpful for us to have. I mean, to some extent, I think to the ordinary human being who looks at this, it's somewhat counterintuitive to think that this project is going to have zero impact on parking. I mean, and you may be right about that, but it is clearly counterintuitive. And so I think the more data that you have to support that, the more comfortable we would be in explaining any decision that we might make. So if there's some data that would sort of buttress the notion that truly there's only going to be a parking demand of roughly 71 spaces during all times, and therefore that the building literally provides sufficient parking to meet that demand, save for the 2 or 3 visitors that may come along, it would be helpful for us to know that.
Sure,
So if that data is, okay. Is that pretty much concluded what you have?
I'm not going to open the can, she was happy with my stuff. I'm not going to go back.
Do board members have any questions about the traffic or parking issues?
I guess I have a couple. There's no, am I correct, there's no overnight parking in any of these zones? Is that right?
I did not see any signs that allowed overnight parking in that, and so I think you have a townwide ordinance, I'm not sure.
Okay.
And I don't know, I didn't investigate it separately again. That was just, I did a cursory review of the data he collected.
I will tell you, when I went out 7 o'clock in the morning, there were very few vehicles parked at 7, but the breakfast crowd came shortly thereafter.
And some of the areas you say don't allow all-day parking because it's only for a limited period of time. Yeah. Ms. Conley, do you agree that, or maybe it's part of industry standards, I think, as Mr. Gillen alluded to, but that the entire length of that Zone E along Elliott Street, the 600 feet and however is appropriately considered as a, as a parking area for this, for Central here, Central Square? Or?
Yes.
'Cause it seems to me that a lot, I don't know how many, I can't remember how many spaces are along here, but it seems a lot of the unoccupied space, it adds to the total number of spaces, and therefore, I think probably a lot of the unoccupied spaces are down.
I completely agree with you. I thought the same thing, although that is a reasonable distance for walking. Everyone's definition of reasonable,
Okay.
There's very, very many different reasonable definitions for walking distances. What I did then is I looked at each of his charts and just read the columns down rather than across, because instead of looking at the total percent occupied, which might be inflated as you say, or might be deflated as you say because of that extra capacity out on Elliott Street to the east, I looked in A, the capacity was 7. What did we have in A? B was 17, what did we have in B? So I did not put as much weight on E, which was that zone that you're discussing with the 69 spaces, because that is a
69,
little
yeah,
further
okay.
away. So if you kind of look at an individual analysis and look at the individual columns, as I said, the only 2 columns that were really what I would call effectively always full, because they always had either the total number or one less than the total number, were areas C and F. The others had parking available. So even excluding that zone, you still do have parking spaces that are available in that core.
Okay.
I did think I questioned that same thing.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I will tell you, if there was another cross street somewhere between Morris and Top, I would have stopped at the cross street, just that there was no cross street, so that's why I went up there.
Frank, any questions?
It just seems very counterintuitive. I mean, going through that intersection, being at that intersection, sometimes using the merchants in that section, I could buy the explanation that some of the spaces closer to the shops are high turnover. You want to leave Tino's with your pizza hot, not 2 hours later. but I guess basically what I'm hearing is you two professional traffic people are in agreement that there's not a lot of extra impact here. Is that correct?
That is correct. I mean, based on the number of apartments and the typical trip generation of apartments, which tends to be lower than, say, a single-family house or other land uses, certainly less than commercial land uses, the number of trips that are going to be generated is relatively low compared to the baseline traffic. So it isn't something that, as the average driver, you're all of a sudden going to see a stream of traffic coming out. You will hardly notice. You might notice as you travel on that section of Elliott Street, if someone pulls out or is waiting to turn in, you know, that might give you a little hiccup in your driving. But otherwise, I don't think the average driver is going to be able to tell the percentage of an increase here is probably very similar to what the percentage variation from day to day is on the street anyway.
But you're also telling me that the average parker isn't going to notice a difference. Is that correct?
Well, I didn't look at that parking demand number that was presented. I didn't verify that ITE parking rate of 1.2 or whatever that Jack just quoted. That wasn't, that wasn't in the materials that I had reviewed. So I can't speak to whether that is correct. I just more was commenting on there is parking available, as I said, in this entire zone and more specifically in the areas immediately adjacent to this. So I don't think if you did have guests coming, they're not going to be parking far afield. There is plenty of parking available right in front of the development.
And again, I understand that that 1.23 is the average peak period parking demand. Whenever you have something that's an average peak, there's some that are a little 50% are above it, some 50% are below it. So we did design for the average peak, but there may be some points that in areas that are not served by transit that it might go above that. But that's the number that it has for the low and mid-rise with the average peak, and that's the one we designed for.
Well, I'm going to discount the transit discount.
Okay.
Well, yeah, he isn't taking a transit discount.
I understand that.
That's
So
just the standard.
That's
Yeah.
why the manual, the engineer, that's a standard traffic engineering manual?
It doesn't say, it just says that it says the parking demand was less with the transit. It didn't quantify that.
That wasn't my question. The 1.23 is a standard number
Yeah.
that's recognized by your profession.
Yep.
And it
This
comes from a
is
standard text.
the fourth edition of the parking generation ITE report, and on page 53, for the average peak period parking demand, it is 1.23 vehicles per dwelling unit.
Okay. I think that we're going to hear a lot of comment. I suspect that we're going to hear a lot of comment concerning the parking issue. I think I'll wait for the questions till we hear from members of the public on that issue.
Why don't we open it up to the public on this question of traffic and parking?
Peter Mullen, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 2, 19 Gaskins Road. Just as a preliminary matter, the various reports that people have been referring to, it would be very helpful to the citizens and residents of the area if we could get a chance to look at those things in advance of these meetings. The town planner provided some to me yesterday, and I distributed them to some people that I knew would be interested. But when these various things are received, if they could be posted on the town website, that would be very helpful. There really hasn't been an opportunity for residents to kind of review things in detail and have questions prepared. I'd like to address the traffic issue first. As I understand what Mr. Gillian has done traffic studies with regard to 36 Central Avenue, 50 Elliott Street. I think twice he's done traffic studies with regard to the site known as 131 Elliott Street. And I think he's attempted to calculate traffic at one point relating to the Steel and Rye building. As what I understand he's done here is to take numbers that he's generated in the past and adjust them to submit a traffic study with regard to the current 40B proposal for 131. There's been huge change in this neighborhood since the early studies that he's done. And I think the numbers that he's using are based on those early studies. I don't know when the actual traffic counts were taken, whether they're taken in 2010, whether they were taken in 2011. But that's prior to the plate opening. It's prior to Steel and Rye opening. We're about to have an even further change in traffic in the area when the actual rental begins at 50 Elliott Street. And I would urge this board to require that there be an actual traffic study currently, rather than using this old and I would say outdated data. I know in the morning, a lot of the flow on Central Avenue approaching Elliott Street seems to depend upon the lights down at Reedsdale Road and Central Avenue, and that you get a flow of traffic depending upon when the light changes down there. I think we need current data. I would also urge the board to actually get the standard that Mr. Gillian is using with regard to ingress and egress. I know that with regard to the standards that he was using with regard to prior studies at 131 Elliott Street, there was a serious question as to whether it was an applicable standard or not. With regard to one of the standards that he was using, I don't profess to be a traffic engineer, but when you looked at the standard, he was kind of making adjustments. I know with regard to one of them, there was a question of whether you used a straight line or a curved line to kind of interpret back from the standard. The standard was from a much larger facility, a much larger building. And he was using, I forget whether it was the straight line or the curved line, but the planning board essentially said, well, what if you do it the other way? What if you use the other standard? And it made a substantial difference in the number of entrances and exits that you would have. So I would urge you to get to take a look at the actual standard that he's using. I'd also urge you with regard to, as I understand what Ms. Conley has done, is she's been essentially just checking his math. I don't see, the fundamental question is whether the underlying data accurately reflects traffic in this intersection today as opposed to when the underlying studies were taken. With regard to parking, I believe that the town's zoning bylaw generally requires 1.5 parking spaces per unit with regard to residential development. The project that's proposed here includes predominantly 2-bedroom units, but there are some 3-bedroom units as well. And I think it's unrealistic to think that there's only going to be 1.23 cars per unit of this development. I think you ought to take a look at whatever the standard that he said that he's using, and whether that seems to be appropriate to this development. I don't know what information you can obtain from the applicant as to their plans for marketing this development. But I think that there's a high likelihood that you're going to have young professionals, either married couples or people having roommates and 2 or 3 people renting one of these units. And I think that will greatly influence how many vehicles there are in these units. You know, I mean, I think having the access to the trolley line may well be a selling point here, but that doesn't mean that the people aren't going to have, each one of the people who was a resident in these units isn't going to have a car. I don't know whether the plan is to assign these 72 parking spaces that they're proposing. I don't know whether they're going to be assigned to a particular unit, or whether it's just going to be first come, first serve. I think that's something that you need to clarify. Parking certainly is a problem in the area. Parking's likely to become even more of an issue with regard to the opening or the rental of the 50 Elliott Street. I think that development certainly has enough parking with regard to the residences that are located there, but I don't know what the impact is likely to be from visitors. Certainly, I don't know where Steel and Rye is doing their valet parking, but I know I've heard complaints from people all around the neighborhood that, including the Milton Hill side of the neighborhood, that you know, cars are getting parked you know, regularly at night in their area, and that you know, if this development is taking up even more parking spaces, we're going to have even more of an issue. I haven't really carefully looked at any of the numbers that are in the most recent parking study. I'd like to have an opportunity to do that and maybe have further comments at some other time. Thank you very much.
Okay. Appreciate your comments.
Mr. Chairman, if I can just suggest, in the event that the board does request the traffic signal warrant analysis, those additional counts that we discussed earlier, that those ATRs, those tube counters, will provide a good, you know, 2014 real-time traffic volume, and we'll be able to tell whether that falls underneath what those 2017 projections were, to make sure that the analysis is a conservative condition. If the board does have that concern that a lot has happened and that those 2017 projections may not be accurate, those tube counters will not only provide the information for the traffic signal warrant analysis, but it would also provide a check to see, are we on the right track and were the projections correct?
Good point. Thank you for that. I mean, you raised some interesting questions. Let me, Mr. Gillen, do you want?
If I might, number one,
the threshold question, I think you have the answer, and it's one that I agree is an important one. Is it what level of, when did you last do your counts?
2011.
Okay.
Yep. And what was being referred to as trip projections, there were 2 different ways to do it. I did it in the ITE trip generation report does give 2 methodologies of projecting trips. One is a straight rate, and the other is if you do a curve. There's a curve for the larger the project is. You may have a better curve if you use the equation as opposed to a better prediction if you use the curve as opposed to the rate. In accordance with the ITE trip generation handbook, I had done it one way last time, and then he asked about, Mr. Mullen asked about this, and I indicated yes, obviously the curve could give you a more conservative, but in this particular case, he looked at the linear regression, and I'm not going to get into it, but based on some of the criteria the handbook said, I did it the correct way, but the board still wanted to see the more conservative way, which I had no problem with because it still worked. What I will tell you here is on figure 3 that you have with my latest, not the latest, the memo of June 19th, you'll see that I had used the curves, and for the 57 units, you'll see 32 trips in the morning based on the curve, and if I used the rate, it would have been less than that, it would have been 25. I used the curve for the PM peak hour, which is 49. If I had used the rate of 0.52, it only would have been 30. If I had looked at a Saturday, my projection was 43 that I designed for, and if I had used the rate, it would have been only 27. So what I'm saying to you is I did it the more conservative way, anticipating that this question may come up. So it did work, but that's the way I did it, and that's why.
Okay.
And I would agree with that, because that is one of the things, we didn't just check his math, we did check his sources, and when you check the IT trip generation manual, that is always something you look at to make sure that the, whether the fitted curve or the average rate, which is more appropriate for this type of development, in this case, it was the higher.
I understood that you checked his methodology, not just his mathematics. So I understood that. But it seems to me, for two independent reasons, it's probably a good idea to get existing traffic counts and not rely on 2011. I mean, that data is easy to obtain, and it serves two functions here. It'll be a check on other aspects of your analysis, and it will also inform us as to whether or not a traffic signal even makes sense. So I assume the applicant will be willing to do that. I don't think that's a big deal. I frankly, I can't speak for my other members, but I had no intention of closing the public hearing tonight anyway. I mean, I did not expect that we were going to cover all issues and have all information that was available to us. So you'll have ample time. It's not a big deal to do it, I assume. You do it.
It's a little bit of work on the task.
Again, I mean, unless Steve wants to talk privately, number one, I can always hope about closing a hearing, but believe me, I did not expect that it was going to be closed. And I think that, it's reasonable, I certainly assume that, as Jennifer explained, as well as Jack Gillen, in addition to that curve business, but the known anticipated development was factored in anyway, so I would doubt very much, but it's silly for me to guess, that there'd be a big discrepancy. So, again, it's not that it was ignored, which is why the methodology was correct. But again, it makes sense, as long as you're...
We're not suggesting it was ignored, but...
As long as you're interested in the numbers for the warrant, it is true, and I don't see any problem with doing that, so...
Okay. And I guess the other issue that came up in the course of Mr. Mullins' conversation was about the parking assumption. And quite frankly, at the last public hearing, I think I openly expressed my surprise at the notion that 57 apartment units, some 3 bedrooms, were going to generate 70 or 71 parking spaces. I found that to be counterintuitive, given what I know about younger people and their need for vehicles. Having 3 children myself who are in their early 30s, I have a pretty good idea of things like that. And I found it hard to believe. Even though there might be the trolley there, it's hard, unless they're going to have zip cars, that they're not going to have more.
Well, I'm sure I'll revisit that, but again, it's important to keep in mind that this particular type of unit usually does not have an awful lot of kids, and usually does not have the number of vehicles associated with a single-family home or a duplex or something like that. But I'm not going to put anyone on the spot. I'll revisit that. And
Yeah, I think you need to, because, I mean, just from a common sense standpoint, I don't know what the rents are going to be at these apartments, but I assume that a lot of them are going to be attractive to, 2 young guys or 2 young women, or one of each, or whatever the configuration might be, and they're probably likely to each have a car. And if that's the case, then 70 parking spaces doesn't sound like enough to me. And that's just a common sense view of it. So I'd like you to revisit that with whatever information, data, I mean, I've tried about 50 cases involving the ITE trip generation manual, and sometimes I'm its friend and sometimes it's its enemy. It depends on who's paying me for any given case. And it's not a Bible. I mean, it's the best available information, and you use it because that's the practice in the industry, but it's not always right. And so whenever
We're precise, we're just not accurate.
Right. So whatever, right. So whatever information you can give us that would give us some comfort level that there's going to be very little demand of the residents of this development on the constraints of parking that already exist, that'll be an important factor for us. So, yes.
Just one point on that, not to in any way gainsay the need to do this, and again, our job is to try to get you comfortable, so we're happy to do that. One thing I would point out in terms of what Mr. Mullen said, if we're reading the zoning bylaw correctly, it's actually one space per unit. In the residential district, which is a small portion of our site, it's one space per dwelling unit. Even though the bulk of our site is C, I believe it's C, but the business district, the way we read it, it says that for residential use within that business district, it reverts to that one per unit. I'm not saying that doesn't mean we should satisfy you in terms of the actual data.
I understood.
But if we're wrong, then we need to address that when we get to waiver time. So if somebody can check, and if you tell us that we read it correctly, great. If not, then we would add that as a waiver request.
Okay. Are there any other, please, come up.
Good evening. Peter Jackson, town meeting member, Precinct 2, and I live at 14 Capon Street. Traffic was probably the major issue unresolved in the eligibility letter that was provided for this, saying that significant work on traffic needed to be done. In terms of the comments from the Board of Selectmen and the DPW and the public, both before the first hearing and at the first hearing. And I think that I find the scope of work and the review of traffic is very incomplete and inadequate. It relies on traffic counts that were generated a significant number of years ago, and they were generated by the proponent, does not review whether these counts are reliable or reflect current conditions. It reviews traffic number calculations using standard computer-based traffic programs, and it identifies a service level of D for the Elliott Street Central Avenue intersection after build-out. Is a service level of D appropriate and acceptable to the town? Is it acceptable to the town or consistent with reasonable requests for a major redevelopment project? What kind of mitigation will be provided for this loss of service in the intersection? As anyone who knows who travels through this intersection, there are significant morning rush hour backups, and navigating a broad, asymmetrical intersection, it's a game of chicken, even now, and it's not for the faint of heart. Numbers by themselves do not describe the current traffic condition, and this is before the project is even built. And Steel and Rye generates not only parking demand, which was talked about, but it generates significant traffic. And so the conditions with Steel and Rye in place certainly is important. In discussing site access and egress, they talk about moving the building egress off of Central Avenue and moving it onto Elliott Street, but they don't describe where on Elliott Street it's located. There's no recognition of the steep slope of Elliott Street right at the access point. This already causes problems with cars approaching the intersection, and it causes cars to slide right into the intersection in snowy or icy conditions, right in front of where this new egress point is. In the review of the site distance, they talk about adequate site distance, but there's no recognition of the gradient of the street, the steep gradient of the ramp that's coming out of the underground parking to get up there. Good design practice requires there to be a landing at the top of the ramp so a vehicle can see, and there's none provided here. And it doesn't take into effect the retaining walls that enclose that access ramp that limit visibility up Elliott Street as you're pulling out of there. These issues are nowhere discussed in any of this report. There's no discussion of how service vehicles, moving vans, package delivery, or trash handling will be accommodated at the site. In looking at the traffic volumes, they say in some cases it's not a matter of the number of cars, but the problem is the pedestrian and the parking movements that are occurring right there. Some of it may be, but that is a fact of life there, and so you don't discount the fact that cars have to stop for pedestrians to cross, or cars get backed up because somebody's trying to pull into a parallel parking spot. That's part of life there and part of traffic at the intersection. Consideration of parking for the building is non-existent. There is no analysis of how many parking spaces are required to handle 122 bedrooms in the building or where guests will park. The town in planning board has often required 1 space per bedroom. That's 122 spaces. There's no discussion of the availability of parking for the retail businesses in the district, although Mr. Gillen has added some information tonight related to that. We all know that adequacy of parking is the life and death of retail. Merchants have already been highlighting to the town the difficulties with parking. The traffic is going, this project is going to exacerbate them. There's no second way about it. On the parking, the bottom line, if you just look at it conceptually, they're proposing to remove 1 parking space. So if the parking is already inadequate, they're going to remove a parking space, and they're adding new uses which are going to generate more traffic. There has got to be inadequate parking. There's no other way about it. They talk about the number of spaces available in guest parking, which they haven't projected the number of guest parking, but I would make another conjecture, and that's that because of the underground parking and the steep, unsafe ramp coming out of the building right on that steep slope on Elliott Street, that residents of the building will pull their cars out and park them on the street and take those street parking spaces to use in their everyday comings and goings. I have several neighbors that in the morning and night they pull their cars down into the driveway, and then during the day they pull them out, put them on the street, and work from the street so that they don't have to deal with driveways all day. So that's another reality of parking use there. So I think the bottom line is that we need a significant better understanding of the current and future traffic conditions and mitigation that will be offered for the traffic impacts, a complete analysis of the current parking and future projected parking demand. I think what we need is a new comprehensive traffic and parking study, including counts, including taking into account the new apartment buildings and the tremendous popularity of Steel and Rye that have just jammed that area up, and all the other redevelopment that's happened there. I don't believe they have even begun to address the traffic and parking issues. Thank you.
Thank you. So, go ahead.
Just a quick comment on that, not in lieu of any engineer comments, but naturally, we don't believe, based on the studies and our knowledge, that a lot of the information and concern that Mr. Jackson just expressed are accurate. I respect his statements and his concerns, understood, but both with what we have and what we will set forth for the next hearing, again, we don't think that really, what he said really is borne out. I would just point out 2 things. Ironically, to the extent that he's saying Steel and Rye, for example, or the area in general, already has really tight conditions and a bad condition, that actually, I'm not agreeing that that's true, that there are existing problems. But to the extent that that's true, it actually makes it less of an impact for our project, because we, on a prorated basis, we're adding a de minimis amount compared to what he is saying is an already existing condition. And so you look for, whether it's 40B or any project, frankly, perhaps even more so in a 40B, but you look at what is the impact of the project. So to the extent that there's an existing condition, it's not our fault, we can't be taken to task for it, number one. Number two, and I think I said this when we just briefly, because it was getting late at the end of the first hearing, all of the questions and the board's questions and the things that we will do, absolutely appropriate. I'm not in any way gainsaying that. But I think there's just a tendency to compare to nothing happening at that site. And even without a 40B proposal, your own zoning bylaw, a lot by right and even more by special permit, which is typically contemplated to be issued if you meet certain standards, there's going to be a fairly significant development on that site anyway, with impact very similar to what we've been discussing. So I think, again, especially because Mr. Jackson was the last speaker, so it's easy for me to remember, as opposed to earlier speakers, even if those concerns are accurate, the fact is, it seems to be compared to nothing being there. And unless you say that a property owner doesn't have a right to develop under the zoning bylaw, again, not looking at it from a 40B viewpoint, it's just not a fair comparison. That's all I would point out. And when I say fair, I don't mean anybody's intentionally being unfair, just human nature that you're comparing it to what's there now. But the zoning bylaw contemplates that there'll be fairly significant development there. And all the more so given what a great smart growth site it is.
Anyone else, please come forward.
Can I respond to his comment to me
You can
very briefly?
come forward and speak if you like.
I don't compare or mean to compare any proposed condition with a no-build option. Nobody in town wants the no-build option. However, our options to design where the access and egress go and how they're designed is much more limited in the current format of the proposal. The ability to negotiate mitigation to address some of the traffic issues which we believe will happen out there is much more limited under the 40B scenario. We all want development there, and I have no problem with an affordable development there. But I think it's got to be, the way 40B works is if there is a dialogue and a negotiation between the town and the proponent to arrive at something that meets both their needs. And I think that's what we're hoping to achieve.
I appreciate that. I think that's some common ground, and thank you.
Thank you.
Please.
Hi, Keith Mills, 39 Hawthorne Road. I also own the little wine, bread, and cheese store that's directly across the street from where the proposed site's going to be. Yeah, I guess I'm not sure what to say at this point in time because I feel it's almost piling on more than anything else. But I think I just wanted to add a couple of things. Is, again, to Peter's position is, we think a development would be great there. We just want to make sure it's the right development. And if we seem impassioned about it, it's because we're the neighbors. We live here. We go by there every day. So it means a lot to us that, that it's done right and it's done right the first time. And I would find it difficult, anybody at this table, to think that, maybe having fresher information or better information from 2011 to try to make this thing right. I don't think that seems too wrong or not. Anecdotally, I'm at the store, been there 13 years. I'm there basically 6 days a week. There's not a day that somebody comes by, or a week somebody comes by on a Friday or Saturday and said, sorry, I haven't been by in a couple of days. Every time I come by, there's no place to park. There's a parking issue. Now, it would be, wrong of me to say, people have told me that, there's a reasonable distance you can walk here to come and shop. I don't think that'd be a very good business plan. The fact of the matter is, people will walk the distance that they think that's reasonable or not. And I think for someone to say there's a prescribed distance of 50 feet, 100 feet, or whatever it is unreasonable. All I know is people don't come in my shop from time to time because they can't find a place to park. That concerns me. And for anybody to think that a bigger building across the street that's going to take more parking, spaces away, that's going to add more people, going to add more cars, isn't going to make things more dicey, I think they're mistaken. Again, I would just say is, we look to you, to help to make sure that this project, works for everybody. And just currently, right now, we feel a little uneasy about it, and we'd like to see it, tighten up a little bit.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Hi, good evening, everyone. I'm Gene Irwin, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 9. A little background. My wife grew up in that area. Her grandparents have been in the area. 3 generations of her family. My grandparents came out of that neighborhood. Both families have maintained family and vast real estate holdings in that neighborhood, so we're well aware of it. My dry cleaning is done down to Central Dry Cleaners. My hair was cut Saturday at Mackey's. The liquor I drank the other night came out of Central Liquors. I wish I had a little more tonight. As Alex Whiteside can attest, I attended these meetings on this traffic probably 5 years ago with my wife, begging the town, hey, you've been at this for years, please make a decision. I know this has recently gone into the hands of the Board of Appeals, but for years, Alex, Pete Jackson, and everyone else can attest, there have been hundreds of meetings on this thing, on this parcel, and I think there's a huge double standard. I didn't see the owner of the wine shop fighting about his people parking in the neighborhood, okay? When I think the biggest problem in the neighborhood is Steel and Rye. Steel and Rye has cars all over that neighborhood all night long. And I think it was this board here that told them they didn't have to use the 6 spaces underneath their own place. A huge double standard, and they gave them to William Ravis. And I think the Conleys have always been the whipping boy for every single abutter in the neighborhood, and I don't think it's fair. And I say I drive through the square 3 days a week, taking my son to UMass. I'm a real estate agent in the area. I drive through there every day going to Dorchester, show apartments, condos, whatever. And I think this has gone on way too long. I don't think the Conley's traffic is the issue, nor has it ever been, nor will it be. And I say I continue to do my shopping down there. Saturday, I was in Mackey's between 12 and noon. I had the first parking space at the gas station across the street, right directly in front of Mackey's. Tuesday morning, I was at 9 o'clock at the plate, signing an offer with the client. Again, no traffic problem, parked right there. And I have apartments in the area. I think the Conleys have, I don't know of anyone else down there who has guest parking, but the Conleys do. As a real estate agent, when you have listings like that, and I list plenty of units in those areas, if there's one parking space, there's one parking space. That's the way it's advertised. That's the way it's written into the contract. And I assume that's the way it's going to be written here. And I believe we've had the same 4 or 5 individuals holding the entire town hostage for several years. I mean, this is the mother of all filibusters. And I respectfully request that you folks give parking due consideration, but I think these same people were griping before the plate, before Steel and Rye, before 36 Elliott, before 50 Elliott, and they never show up for anyone else's meetings in general, except for this one. And I think it's unfair, and I think I speak for a lot of people in this town. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Anyone else wish to speak?
I've got something on another topic, other than traffic and parking.
Fine.
Alex Whiteside, I'm the chair of the planning board. I'm would like to raise the matter of affordable housing and the affordable housing plan. And as I understand it, this project is being proposed under Mass Housing Partnership's Permanent Rental Financing Program. And as I read that, they make a loan for 20 or 30 years, and then they get paid back and they drop out of the picture. And I just want to make sure that when Mass Housing Partnership drops out of the picture, the affordability of the affordable apartments is maintained in perpetuity as the statute requires and as the Supreme Judicial Court has said is legal and proper. Beyond that, when Mass Housing Partnership ceases to be the subsidizing agency, someone has to monitor these units, because the way it works often is that you don't specify specific units to be the affordables. You simply make sure that you have 20%, 25%, and it's 25% here, I believe, 25% income eligible families living in the units, and they obviously have to be divided between the 2s and 3s. Although it is possible to specify specific affordable units, usually it's done by making sure that at all times you have 25% income eligible people living in your development. And the way you do this is obviously your rental agent, the building's rental agent, will have a list and will make sure that 25% of the units are, in fact, rented to income eligible people. But the rental agent has to be monitored because the rental agent will be an employee of the developer or of the operator, will be the operator. And Mass Housing Partnership, for the life of the loan, will be monitoring to make sure that 25% of the families living in this development are income eligible and qualified, and that the housing, the affordable housing plan by which the families get put on the list. In other words, there's usually a lottery of some sort, and there is a resident preference, which needs to be specified. But the subsidizing agency will make sure that the agent who is running the development on the premises is in fact using the list properly and renting to people who are income eligible. When Mass Housing Partnership drops out of the picture after 20, 30 years, however long the financing is, then someone else, another entity, unless Mass Housing Partnership can be signed on to continue to work for this development in perpetuity, which is not likely, probably the housing authority. And the developer will have to enter a contract with the housing authority to do the work, to make sure the list is properly maintained and to make sure that the tenant selection is done fairly and in accordance with the tenant selection plan. So, in the comprehensive permit, if one were to be issued, it needs to be the affordability needs to be addressed, and that it needs to be made clear that Mass Housing Partnership will be supervising the list and the selections from the list, and to make sure that 25% of the units, both the twos and the threes, are occupied by income-eligible people. And it's got to specify that affordability will continue in perpetuity even after the financing may have been paid off. And it should specify that there needs to be a new agency to substitute for Mass Housing Partnership to ensure that after they drop out, affordability is maintained in perpetuity. So we just finished our housing production plan, and the Ungledy House had one of these expiring uses attached to it, and they had to scramble in order to protect their affordability, because 20 years can pass pretty quickly, and these things, if the affordability goes, they no longer count on the town's 40B list towards their 10% goal. They just get removed from it, and it's important to the town that they not be removed and that they be kept on there forever. So that's my principal point. Another point, I don't, along the sideline, along the town land, they've got a 5.5-foot strip on which they propose to put their scaffolding to build the building. And I just don't see that 5.5 feet is nearly wide enough for them to stage a construction. The zoning does require only 6 feet, but still, 5.5 feet is not enough. So, thanks.
Thank you. Peter, you want to just briefly address those
I will be
issues?
brief and not by way of disagreement, just explanatory, if you will, and I will try to be brief. I agree in large part with virtually everything that Mr. Whiteside said. The regulatory agreement that MHP will require, and that's all within the domain of the subsidizing agency, the case of Amesbury versus Housing Appeals Committee makes very clear that, although you want to make sure that that's in place properly, but that's up to the subsidizing agency. But I can assure you it's a very thorough, just closed 2 large apartment developments with MHP, and it's a very thorough, good document that also addresses the monitoring and all of that, and the tenant selection plan, et cetera, et cetera. So I certainly agree with the things that were expressed, and it'll meet with your satisfaction. Not that you get to change it, as I say, under the Amesbury case, but believe me, it's fine. They take this stuff very seriously at MHP and all the subsidizing agencies. The second point, the only minor point of disagreement, which is probably a moot point, is it is legal to not require the units to be in perpetuity if the subsidizing agency lock-in period for affordability, which I believe is 30 years, if their regulatory agreement says, okay, that's it, it's not illegal for that to be the end of the affordability. That said, most towns, and certainly you'll decide this when you decide if a permit is granted, a lot of towns, most towns, I don't mind admitting, do want it in perpetuity. Perfectly fair and valid point. I will only say this to be brief. What we typically do, in addition to the condition, is we say that there shall be a springing regulatory agreement, for lack of a better term, that can be recorded if you want at the time the initial subsidizing agency documents are recorded. So it would be there of record. It is another affordable housing restriction similar to what would be in place already with the subsidizing agency. It springs into effect at the expiration of the subsidizing agency, in this case MHP, regulatory agreement, and then it would cover all the things that Mr. Whiteside is concerned about. What typically is done, in my recommendation, is, rather than specify the housing authority, because who knows what's going to be in 30 years, but you reserve the right to have the town basically designate who the monitoring agent would be and require that a modest, sorry, Steve, but it's fair and it's what happens, that the owner pay a reasonable monitoring fee at that time for that purpose. So again, virtually in agreement, and that's how I would suggest it would be handled at that point. The other quick thing, which I was going to really both state and ask the chairman on the point about the 5.5 feet, we do have on the PowerPoint that was part of our submission that hopefully you folks on the board looked at, some revised site plans and explanation that address some of the remaining, if you will, physical layout, site plan, and land use concerns, including lighting cuts and a few other things, which we certainly are prepared to go into. I figured that we would, and one of them would address that setback. We're happy to do that tonight, totally up to the board in terms of whether we do that briefly now or put those kinds of things off until the next hearing.
I mean, I can't speak for everyone else. I just assume do it now if we can do it.
Yeah, that's fine.
I mean, ideally, we'd be done at 10 o'clock
Yeah,
if we could
absolutely.
do that.
Yeah, no, I don't think it'll take too long, so I don't know if that's more, Kurt, I'm sorry, Kurt with the PowerPoint, or Kurt and? You need this? Yep. I don't go near the technology, I leave that to the experts.
Is this microphone hearing me okay? My name's Kurt Raber. I'm the architect from Brown, Lindquist, Finuccio, and Raber Architects. And pleased to be here and be brief as I can to go through the next couple of slides about the revisions to the architectural plans that we've made since the last time we were before you. The building has, can I borrow that pointer? Where's he on? There we go. The building footprint at the ground level, of course, it's at grade exposed where you see this dark bold line. So that's the first story wall at the east end of the property. So that